All right, I want to describe in brief detail, at least, the Crusades, just generally, and then I want to look also in this video at the first of the four accounts of the First Crusade that you're assigned for this class. So the Crusades were a phenomenon born out of several trends in the High Middle Ages. One of these was the Peace of God movement. That because there was so much emphasis on Christian knights ceasing to fight with one another, there needed to be some outlet, that was where they could properly channel their aggression, so to speak. And at least this is the way that it's pitched by Pope Urban II. We'll look at that in a few minutes here when we look at that account. But the peace of God certainly was a contributor to this, right? That there is legitimate warfare and there is illegitimate warfare. There is just war and there is unjust war, to go back to the formulations of St. Augustine. And the Crusades were seen by most in this period as just warfare. Now, at times they took turns that could be criticized, like, for instance, during the First Crusade when and even in a few subsequent crusades when they, took their aggressions out on Jews in Europe, and then even some of the massacres that they committed in what they called the Holy Land. The chroniclers of these events did not always, at least not universally, see these as a positive, right? And so, there were still comments about the justice of the cause, but in general, the Christian thrust of this, right? The effort to take lands that were sacred to Christians and make them safe for pilgrims and all of that, all of this was seen as a just cause. The map here shows some of the different crusades. The only one that is concerning us really in this class is the First Crusade. And you can see that there were actually multiple kind of armies that gathered in different places, an army in France and an army up here in Germany, in the city of Regensburg, or Ratisbon as it was known then, and then kind of over here in Burgundy region or southeastern France from Lyon. And they traveled, finally joined up together, or actually they didn't join together, they came to Constantinople at different times, then departed at different times. But the army then made its way across Anatolia and came over here and conquered all of this territory. The First Crusade was the only one that was in any way really successful. It was prompted by the advance of Muslim forces. Now, the Muslims had taken this area that the Christians called the Holy Land, in other words, the Levant region, the Eastern Mediterranean here, all the way back in the 7th century, or even the late 6th century. I guess it was the 7th century. After the death of Muhammad in 632, there were armies, inspired by the cause of Islam that had come up and conquered these territories. They had taken over. Eventually, the city of Damascus became a kind of capital for the Muslims. And Jerusalem was turned into, or, by Muslim tradition, was a holy site. There were events associated with the life of Muhammad that made it holy, and they created a kind of sacred landscape in Jerusalem. And so this city became, as sacred or nearly as sacred for Muslims as it had been for Jews and for Christians. So there was a religious motivation to this, right? According to rumors that spread in Europe, the Muslims had desecrated Christian shrines, had killed Christian pilgrims. Let's remember how important pilgrimage was. We've talked about that already in this class, as a kind of penitential act and an act of piety. And the ultimate destination for pilgrims was Jerusalem. And so if there are rumors being spread that Muslims are killing Christian pilgrims and desecrating their sites, this would certainly inspire a great deal of excitement back in Christian Europe, right? Another thing that had happened that helped to prompt this was that the Eastern sect or branch of Christianity, what we would call the Greek Orthodox Church, had over the centuries grown apart from the Western Christian Church, or as we might call it, the Roman Catholic Church. That there were theological differences, there were differences in practice, and this had erupted into a full-scale schism in the middle of the 11th century, when a dispute over theology led the Pope to excommunicate the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Constantinople to respond in the same way by excommunicating the Pope and his representatives. So all of that blew up in the middle of the 11th century. There was a great desire on the part of the Pope in Rome to reunite the two main branches of Christianity. And the thought was, if we can aid the Greek Christians, who were part of this thing that was still called the Roman Empire, right, but based in Constantinople. If we can aid these people, well, maybe that will prompt them to reunify with us theologically. We can set aside our differences and bring, again, unity to Christianity, right? So all of these things are part of the motivation for this. We should also mention, sorry, I should have brought this up earlier, that, there were Muslims in Iberia and, what's now Spain and Portugal, that this was seen as a major threat. And so the term crusade, with all that it entailed, was eventually applied to Christian efforts to retake this territory. There were also crusading efforts, and the term crusade came to have a great deal of clout in this period. It meant something to be on crusade. And I'll talk more about that in a moment here. But the term crusade was also applied to Christian efforts to take the territory of northeastern Europe, some areas of which were still worshiping pagan gods, all the way into the 14th century. And so the so-called Eastern or Northern Crusade, I guess they're the Northern Crusades, right, were an effort to do this. Now, what made something a crusade? Well, usually it had... in every case, I should say, it had religious sanction. The Pope had decreed this a crusade. And in most cases, the Pope offered something called a plenary indulgence. We've already talked a little bit about indulgences. A plenary indulgence was a blanket forgiveness of sins. In some cases, this could even be applied to one's, departed, dearly departed. In other words, could help someone in purgatory. But for the most part, this was applied to the person themselves. If a knight went on crusade, he was promised by the Pope that all of his sins committed up to that point would be forgiven. And, was given the sanction of the church and told that they were warring in a just cause. And so, historians have often looked at the motivations for crusades. Historians several decades ago pointed out that, most of those who went on the first crusade were younger sons of nobles and royals who were not due to inherit their own kingdom or their own, duchy or something like that. And so they wanted to go to the east to claim territory there. That the motivation was primarily economic. But further research has, in many ways, shown that idea to be problematic. The main piece of evidence that counters the economic motive, and this is not to say that no one had an economic motive, just to say that this was not the dominant motive. The main piece of evidence is that after the First Crusade, upwards of 90% of all of the warriors who had committed themselves to crusade, had taken the cross, as they called it in the Middle Ages, turned around and went home. They did not try to claim territories in the Holy Land, even though they had carved out all of this territory you see in the kind of orangish color here, and had created several entities like the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These were all new Christian lands, as it were. But most of the knights didn't stick around to claim any territory. They left. They had received what they wanted, which was forgiveness of sins. They had done a penitential act. Thus, more recently, historians have concluded that the primary motivation here was religious in nature, right? That they took this very seriously. This was not a cynical thing at all. They believed that this cause was just, and that their forgiveness of sins was contingent on their participation in this. Now, there were certainly some who did stick around, a small percentage of them, and claimed territory and became new counts and princes and kings of these territories. But they found themselves constantly in a situation where they were undermanned. They did not have enough people to hold the territory. And so there were repeated calls for further crusades. This is really what prompts the later crusades. The Second Crusade happened roughly 50 years after the first one. It's because the Muslims had retaken the county of Edessa and were sort of pressing on these other territories. The Second Crusade was an abysmal failure. The kings of France and Germany who went there really did very little productively, and the King of France ended up getting sort of trapped and besieged in a castle and had to turn tail and run, or eventually he was captured and had to be ransomed. This was a disaster for them. They did not retake any of the territory. The Third Crusade was prompted after the Muslim recapture of Jerusalem with the Battle of Hattin in 1187. And this inspired a lot of people to go. It wasn't nearly as big as the First Crusade, but the kings of France and England and the Emperor of Germany all participated in this. It also was a failure. The Fourth Crusade was an attempt by the Pope at the time, Innocent III, to direct a crusade. He didn't go on the crusade, but he was trying to call the shots. This thing got waylaid for reasons that we need not go into, and eventually ended up attacking Constantinople, which was seen as intransigent and opposed to the Christian cause by that point. And so this thing went horribly awry, where now we again have Christians fighting against other Christians. And then the later Crusades of the 13th century, a couple of which were led by the French king Louis IX, and one of which was led by the German Emperor Frederick II. These all, failed to retake any significant territory. There were some diplomatic arrangements made by Frederick II that gave Christians greater access to the holy sites there, but this did not involve any real reconquest of that territory. And the two Crusades of Louis IX both were failures. The first one because he got captured while in Egypt, and the second one because he died en route. That's a kind of nutshell history of the Crusades. The one that we want to pay attention to in this class, and the one that I've assigned you to read some sources on, is the First Crusade. And I've given you a set of documents, and this is from a source reader about medieval history, but a set of documents that contains 4 different perspectives. And I think that this is important, right? It's important to see that this was not a monolithic thing. That some participants in the crusade had certain motivations and one perspective, and other participants in the crusade, whether they were willing or not to be participants, right? They had different perspectives. And so the first of these is an account written by a Western Latin Christian. It's actually, his name is Fulcher of Chartres. He was the personal chaplain and priest of Baldwin, who was a French noble who eventually became the first king of Jerusalem. Fulcher is a pretty objective observer, actually, of the events in question, though he never is disloyal in any way to the Christian cause, or certainly to his Lord. But he describes things in rather grisly detail. We also have in this packet of documents an account written by the daughter of the Emperor of Constantinople. Her name was Anna Comnena. She was an absolutely fantastic writer, a wonderful stylist in Latin, she wrote this rather somewhat gossipy and pretty salacious account, but she does it really, from the perspective of the Byzantine imperial family, looking at the motivations of her father and judging these Western Christians to be rather barbarous in their behavior, right? We also have an account written in Hebrew by Jewish survivors of the massacres that happened while the Crusaders were en route through Germany. And this is this account takes some fortitude to read. It's disturbing. It's incredibly violent. But the Jewish motives in writing here and the reaction to these events is obviously very different from that of the Christians. And then finally, we have a Muslim document, a kind of Muslim perspective on all of these things, which obviously is going to be very different, right? So I want to take a look at the first of these in this video, and then the second in the subsequent video. I will look at the other three, right? So this is the account of Fulcher of Chartres. And it gives a kind of, beginning to end depiction. This is only excerpted. This is not the entire chronicle. It's really quite long. But he begins by talking about the council held at Clermont in central France. This is the famous council where Pope Urban II called for the Crusades initially, right? And Fulcher's explanation of this is quite interesting. It refers directly and at length to the peace of God. He says, the Pope looked out and saw that Christians were incessantly at war, quarreling with someone or other. He saw that people stole worldly goods from one another, that many captives were taken unjustly and were most barbarously cast into foul prisons and ransomed for excessive prices, and so forth and so on, right? And so he's talking here about things that were happening within Latin Christendom. In other words, Christians were fighting against Christians, behaving in very unjust ways, pursuing wars that were unjust. That disturbed him. And then he also heard that the interior part of Romania, that's not Romania the country, that's the Roman Empire as it existed in the east, based in Constantinople, had been occupied by the Turks. The Muslim Turks, had won a massive victory over the Byzantine Christians in the year 1071, called the Battle of Manzikert. They had pushed all the way to the western part of Anatolia, or what is modern-day Turkey, and they were bearing down on Constantinople itself. And so Urban had heard about this, and this inspired him to this, according to Fulcher. And so he gives a speech where he reminds all of these knights, sorry for the yawn, of their Christian duties. And he says, if any of you are fighting unjust wars, you need to stop it right now. And we need to reaffirm the truce. This is a reference to the truce of God, which we talked about in an earlier lecture. And then he, lets them know that there are Turks who have taken Roman territory. They are threatening Christianity, and we need to go to their aid, right? Oh, what a disgrace if a race so despicable, degenerate, enslaved by demons. This is not a very flattering depiction of Muslims. That's a reference to Muslims as Christians saw them. Should thus overcome a people endowed with faith in Almighty God and resplendent in the name of Christ. And so we've got to go to their aid, he says. The response was enthusiastic, according to Fulcher, and lots of people turned up. Okay, they agreed under oath to maintain the peace among themselves, but then to go and fight in the Holy Land. And of course, he had offered the plenary indulgence to those who did this. Now, Urban himself, Pope Urban, was facing criticism, and there was even a guy named Guibert who was trying to oust him from the papacy. So this is part of the background. Urban may have had his own motivations for doing this, that, if he were to, call for this crusade and this became a very popular thing, which it did, that his hold on the papacy and really his hold on the religious authority of Western Europe would be solidified, and that seems to have had that effect, right? So Fulcher is a good source for understanding how complex this is. This isn't just, we're Christians, you're Muslims, we're going to fight you kind of thing. In fact, that's almost beside the point. There are so many other factors at play here. He talks about the people who went on crusade. None of the kings themselves got involved in this. They tended to be the brothers or the younger sons of the kings and other major nobles, right? And so the idea that these men wanted to go and carve out their own territories and have their own duchies or their own principalities or their own kingdoms or something like that, can be seen, I guess, from that perspective. There were even a lot of peasants who joined in this, which wasn't necessarily something that, many of the Christian knights saw as a good thing. From there, he goes on to talk about the campaigns themselves. And I don't want to kind of go through every single point here. One of the things that he mentions, now remember, Fulcher is a clergyman, a celibate clergyman by, the standards of the day. And so, he talks about the misfortunes that, and the term Franks is a general term often used just for Christian crusaders. And so as these crusaders made it, into Anatolia, started to campaign there, fight against the Muslims, they were running into all sorts of problems. when they finally decided that it was because of their wickedness that they were not having success. And so, being a good clergyman, he kind of points this out, right? That they expelled the women from the army, and less perhaps defiled by the sordidness of riotous living. In other words, these Christians were, in a way, applying the standards of the clergy to the army in general, that they needed to, like, take their own vows of celibacy, right? They even expelled the married women from, they sent their wives home, as it were, so they could live more holy lives. It's a very clerical perspective on this, okay? And then, they managed to take the city of Antioch, but then they ended up besieged within the city of Antioch. They find a holy relic, which, according to their belief, was the lance that pierced the side of Christ, and that leads to miracles and brings them success ultimately. And then, they take the city of Jerusalem as well. There's a lot of misunderstanding about Jerusalem. He refers, for instance, to the temple of the Lord, which exists in Jerusalem. And he seems to be thinking that the ancient Jewish temple was still there. But had he read some sources that were pretty readily available in Europe at the time, he would have recognized that the temple of the Jews was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE. The building that they're referring to as the temple is actually a Muslim building called the Dome of the Rock. And he's really surprised that all of these Muslims, he calls them Saracens here, held the temple of the Lord in great veneration. They preferred to pray there. And he's like, why is this? I don't understand it. Well, this was a building built by Muslim rulers on the site of the Jewish temple. It's called the Dome of the Rock. It's actually still there today. But he doesn't understand this. So there's a good deal of cultural misunderstanding that happens here. And then, he finally talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. He says that they killed 10,000 people in the temple or in the Dome of the Rock. They were sloshing around in blood up to their ankles. This is a pretty grisly scene, right? He even talks about the greed of the people that, in their plunder, they even split open the corpses of the Muslims because they thought they might have swallowed coins and things like that, right? That this just reaches a kind of orgy of violence that shocks Fulcher. Okay, so a lot to take away from this source and from the Crusades in general. We will move on next time and talk about the other accounts, the Jewish account, the Greek Christian account, and the Muslim account of the same thing.